All right, thank you all for joining us today. It's lovely to share this virtual space with you. My name is Karen Maynor. I'm the Director of Grant Making at CultureWorks. And you will probably notice that as attendees, you are set to listen-only mode today. We have a large number of artists signing on, so to eliminate any background noise, you are muted. I can't see you, unfortunately, though I would love to, but hopefully you can see and hear me. That being said, I do want to make sure that I answer all of your questions. So you can use either the chat or the Q&A feature using the menu either at the top or the bottom of your screen. It should look like two cartoon quote bubbles. And you can use that Q&A button to send questions to me as we go through today's presentation. I'll try to get to as many of the questions as I can during the presentation itself, but I'll also try to save a little time at the end to address anything that I did not get to. A couple of other notes. Today's meeting is being recorded, so if you have to duck out early for another meeting, or if you want to share this information with anyone or refer back to it later on, you'll have access to the recording by the end of the week. And I'll also share today's slide deck. So if you're a visual learner like me, you might like to reference those later, but I don't want you to feel like you have to scribble down everything that I'm saying. You will be able to refer back to those slides later on. All right, today we are here to talk about the Montgomery County Artist Opportunity Grant Program, which helps Montgomery County artists build their artistic careers by funding specific professional development opportunities and the creation of new work. This is going to be our 8th year of doing this program, and since it started, more than 70 artists have been awarded grants to support their development. The purpose of today's session is to give you a solid understanding of the program and to teach you some best practices that you can follow as you are preparing your applications. You might want to know who's behind the program if you don't already. So the Montgomery County Arts and Cultural District is a special unit of county government that supports, nurtures, and encourages the development and preservation of arts and culture in Montgomery County. And one of the many ways that they do that is by providing public funding to arts organizations and through this program to individual Montgomery County artists. CultureWorks is a separate organization with a complementary mission. We are the United Arts Fund and local arts agency for the Dayton region, and we partner with our friends at the MCACD on a lot of different programs and initiatives, including this one. So the MCACD contracts with CultureWorks to administer the Artist Opportunity Grant, which means that we oversee the application process, the panel review process we'll talk about later, and that we serve as your main point of contact as you are applying yourself. The Montgomery County Arts and Cultural District is providing $60,000 for this year's Artist Opportunity Grant cycle. And if you've applied through the program before, or if you were aware of it in past years, you might notice that one exciting change this year is that the maximum individual grant that will be awarded has gone up. So it used to be $3,000. Now you can apply for up to $5,000, which is very exciting. The amount that you request as an artist applicant is based on the amount that you need for a specific project or opportunity. So as part of your application, you're going to include a project budget, which is something we'll talk about later on. But something to note about this program is that it only awards full funding. We don't award partial funding. What that means is that if you request $5,000 and you're selected as a grantee, you'll be awarded $5,000. The reason we don't do partial awards is because we know that as individual artists, a lot of us don't have a lot of flexibility in our budgets, and it wouldn't be realistic to expect you to complete a $5,000 project with only $2,500 or $1,000 in funding. So what you request is what you are awarded if you're selected. In terms of who can apply through this program, you do need to be a Montgomery County resident, because again, this is it's supported by Montgomery County. The funding for the program is public funding, which means that it's supported by Montgomery County residents' tax dollars. So we want to make sure that the program is benefiting the community that is making it possible. You also need to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent legal resident and be at least 18 years old and not be a student, whether that's high school student or enrolled in an undergraduate or graduate studies program. That being said, if either of those criteria apply to you, if you're a student, then we do have a scholarship program called the Leonard P. Roberts Scholarship that we'll start accepting applications for in December. And it awards funding of $1,000 to $4,000 in scholarships per student. So check that out if you're interested or if you know any artists who might be interested in a scholarship. It's open to students at any stage of their college career. But back to the program at hand, the last and probably most important eligibility criteria is that in order to apply for this program, you do have to be a practicing artist. Now, this is a program that is open to artists in all disciplines. So you could be in the visual arts, film, dance, music, writing and storytelling, theater, and more. And it's also open to artists at every stage of their career. So you could be an emerging artist, you could be a professional artist, meaning that you're making a large portion of your regular income through your art. But most importantly, you'll need to show that you've been practicing in your artistic discipline for at least 3 years. But keep in mind that that can include time that you spent in a formal undergraduate or graduate program. So if you studied your artistic discipline, those years you spent as a student do count towards that 3-year artistic practice requirement. You'll also need to show that you have exhibited, performed, or published work as an artist within the past 3 years, and that can include self-created opportunities, performances in non-traditional venues, and it can also include performances and exhibitions that you did, again, as part of your undergraduate or graduate studies, if that applies to you. But as you can probably guess from these eligibility criteria, you do need to be an individual applying to this program. So we know that a lot of artists also own small businesses and startups, which is really awesome. But if you're applying for an artist opportunity grant, just know that the funding has to be used by you. It can't be used to support your small business or your startup. So what is the funding for? Well, this is a project-based grant, which means that artist opportunity grants fund specific opportunities to take your artistic career to the next level. And since it's a program for artists in all disciplines and at different stages in their careers, what an opportunity is going to be a little different for each artist who applies. But the general rules are that it should be something that represents a natural and meaningful step in your artistic career. And it shouldn't be something that you've already done before. So a lot of artists will use artist opportunity grants to pay for costs associated with things like attending conferences or workshops where they're going to develop skills specific to their artistic disciplines or network within their artistic field. And a lot of other artists will use the grants to create new bodies of work. And again, that could be in any discipline. We've seen choreographers use the funding to develop a new performance or production. Of course, visual artists can use the funds to create a new series of visual artworks for exhibition, all kinds of things, you name it. I'm a writer, so I'm always encouraging more writers to take advantage of this program as well. Regardless of the type of opportunity that you're applying for, it does need to be something that is imminent and is going to happen within the next calendar year. So all of your activities have to take place between January 1st and December 31st of 2024 for this application cycle. And since $5,000 is the maximum grant amount, you'll want to focus on projects that fit within that scope. That being said, if you have a project that's going to cost a little more than $5,000, you are still allowed to apply, but in your application, you'll have to explain how you're going to cover the difference. So if the grant's only covering $5,000 and the project will cost $6,000, you'll have to explain where you're going to get the additional $1,000 that you need to cover your budget, whether that's taking something out of your personal funds, or maybe you're going after another grant opportunity that could support it. Now, how can you use the funding? I'm so glad that you asked. So there are, let's see, 6 basic cost areas where you can use the Artist Opportunity Grant funds. And the first one is new, and we're very excited to add this year. So you can use a portion of the Artist Opportunity Grant funds to pay for the cost of your time to execute your specific project if you're applying to create new work. So again, if you're applying to create a new body of work for exhibition or choreography or a script for a performance, then you can pay yourself for the time that you're going to spend creating that artwork. It can be up to 20% of your total funding request. So in other words, if you're applying for the full $5,000, that means that up to $1,000 of the grant could be used to pay yourself for the cost of your time. We will ask you in your application to show us a quick breakdown of how you're coming to the amount that you're paying yourself. So basically the number of hours you're estimating it's going to take you to complete the new work, and then the hourly rate that you're paying yourself. And again, it is only you can only use the grant funds that way to create new works. If you're applying for something like a professional development opportunity, like going to a conference or a workshop, then you can't use the grant funds to pay yourself for the time that you're spending at those kinds of opportunities. Presentation and marketing is pretty straightforward. So of course it includes anything like program booklets, flyers, social media campaigns, anything that you're doing to promote your project. If, for example, it's going to be one of those exhibitions or performances and you want to get the word out there to the community. But it could also be for things like preparing slides or artistic portfolios. So we've had artists in the past who have applied or who have created plans to get their work in front of more galleries, for example. So maybe you need some hard materials that you're going to be using for a very specific purpose like that. That's totally allowable. Professional services are anything where you're paying someone other than yourself to complete activities supporting your project. So often that will be paying an artistic collaborator. So again, maybe you're working on a performance and you want to make sure that you're paying the actors and the dancers and the crew who are going to be supporting that performance. So you could include them in your budget. And it could also be for services like hiring a marketing professional who's going to help you with the ad campaign to promote your project. Materials and supplies, another one that's pretty straightforward. But one important thing to keep in mind here is, as with everything else when we're talking about this program, the materials and supplies have to be specific to the project or opportunity you're applying for. In other words, you couldn't purchase paints and canvases just for general use, but if you needed them for a specific series of work that you were proposing, then you could use the grant funds that way. And then equipment and facilities, there's a little bit of nuance in this one. So you are allowed to use the grant funds to rent equipment and facilities. Facilities are typically going to be venues, again, for things like public performances and shows. It could also be rehearsal space if that's a part of your project. But equipment is restricted to you can certainly use the grants to rent equipment, but if you're purchasing equipment, the equipment has to cost less than $500 per item. Basically, we don't want to see applications for, a $3,000 grant to purchase a new laptop or computer or piece of equipment. While we know that that's really important to artists' work to have that type of equipment, it doesn't really represent a project. It's more an item that you need to do all of your work. So if you use funds for equipment, just make sure that the per item cost is less than $500. And then the last expense category is fees and travel. So these are registration fees. If you're attending something like a conference or a workshop and you need to pay them, $300 or something to participate. And then you can also use the grants for any travel expenses related to that opportunity. So that could include your lodging. If it's something that's going to be more than 100 miles away from home, you need to rent a hotel room. If you need to book a flight, or you could use it for the cost of your mileage. So if you're going to be driving yourself somewhere, you can use the grant funds to pay for your gas and that sort of thing. So those are all of the things that you're allowed to use the grant funds for. There are a few things that you are not allowed to use the grants for, and these are explained in greater detail in our Artist Opportunity Grant Program Guidelines document. And I always encourage applicants to give that document a thorough read before you start your application. But just to highlight some areas where we often get requests. So again, you can't use the grant funds for ongoing work or for general use. So you couldn't say, I'm going to use the grant funds to support my studio work for the next year. It would have to be a specific body of work that you are going to be working on. You also can't use the grant funds for living expenses like rent and utilities, or again, ongoing expenses like if you do rent a studio as an artist and you're on a year-to-year lease or something like that. Since that is a cost that you're incurring as in the course of your normal day-to-day business, you couldn't use the grant funds for that. But again, if you need a temporary space like a rehearsal studio or a performance space, you could use the grant funds for those sorts of things. Again, equipment costing more than $500 per item. And then, of course, any activities that take place outside of the allowable grant period, so that January 1 to December 31st of 2024. So you can't reimburse yourself for things that you've already purchased or things that you've already done before the grant period starts, and you can't use the grant funds after the grant period. Lastly, any commercial or commissioned work, so things that other individuals or companies should be paying you for, those are of course ineligible. And then curatorial projects, we sometimes get questions about. The reason this is not an eligible expense is because the focus of the program is to nurture your growth as an individual artist. And while curatorial projects are certainly valuable activities to do in your artistic career, they're a little more focused on nurturing the artists who are featured in those kinds of exhibitions and such. So we really want the focus to be on you and your work as an individual. We're going to take a deeper dive here in a couple minutes into the application so you know what to expect. But first, to give you a snapshot of what is happening when for this program. The application is open now, so you can start applying. There's a link to the application at cultureworks.org, and the deadline to apply is Friday, October 6th at the very, 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 very end of the day. All of the applications do need to be submitted online, and we do have an application form, so you have to use the form that we're providing. Once the application deadline has passed, CultureWorks and MCACD staff will review all of the applications for basic eligibility. So we're just looking to make sure that you've met all of the general rules and requirements. You're a resident of Montgomery County, you are a practicing artist, your expenses are allowable under the guidelines that we just kind of went through, all of that sort of basic stuff. After that, CultureWorks and the MCACD do not make the funding decisions. We use what's called a public panel process. So if you are not familiar with what a public panel process is and haven't experienced one before, a grant panel is a group of independent volunteer experts in the arts who give their time to review applications and make the funding recommendations. So typically for this program, it's a group of about 8 artists, arts administrators, and arts educators. And we try to get representation from a lot of different artistic fields. But of course, we receive a large number of applications every year, so we can't guarantee that your specific discipline will have representation on the panel, but we really do try our best to make sure that we have a broad spectrum of disciplines. From October to November, those grant panelists will read the applications and score them using a scoring rubric that we provide. They'll do all of that online. And then in mid-November, we bring them together for a group discussion at a public meeting or a public grant panel meeting. The date is to be announced, but we will let you as applicants know well in advance of the public panel meeting because you will be invited to attend so that you can hear the discussion of your application. At that public panel meeting, the panelists will discuss applications one at a time for around 8 minutes each. And then at the very end of the meeting, they'll have a closed discussion where they'll submit their final scores. Sometimes they'll hear different perspectives from each other in the course of the meeting that will make them think differently about an application. So they have the opportunity to adjust their scores as needed right up until the very end. But once they submit their final scores, the panelists will review the final ranked list of applicants from highest average score to lowest average score, and they'll make their funding recommendations based on those scores and the amount of funding that is available. To help you feel comfortable about attending the meeting and listening in, because we think it's a really valuable experience for you to get this free, insightful feedback from all of these other artists. The panelists will not identify you by name during the discussion, so you can sit back and in relative anonymity. They'll refer to you by an applicant ID number and your preferred pronouns. If that's something that you're concerned about, your name is not going to be spoken at the meeting. After that virtual grant panel meeting, then any artists who have been selected for funding by the panel will have a meeting with me and other CultureWorks team members in December. And at that time, we'll go over the next steps in your grant agreement, and then we'll begin distributing funding in January of 2024. So you receive your grant award as one lump sum paid via check, and we issue it to you about 30 days before your project start date. So something I should have mentioned before, although your projects can happen anytime between January and December of 2024, each artist is going to have their own project start and end date that you'll specify based on the specific activities that you're completing. So by the end of 2024, your project must be completed. And once your project is completed, we'll have you fill out a final report, just sharing the outcomes of your project, some pictures telling us how your experience went. All right. So let's talk about what the panelists are actually going to be looking for in your applications. I think that's always a really helpful thing to have in your mind as you're writing your application, so you know how you're being evaluated. So for this program, the panelists are going to use a scoring rubric that is broken into 5 scoring areas. And the first is artistic merit. So here they're looking at the quality, vision, and originality of your work as an artist. And you're going to demonstrate that by providing work samples and a bit of narrative about yourself, which we'll talk about in a minute. Potential impact. This is the potential impact of your proposed project on your artistic career. So the panelists are going to be asking, is the opportunity going to have a meaningful impact on your development? Does it make sense in the context of your overall career? In other words, does it seem like the opportunity that you're seeking is appropriate given your current skill level and experience level? And is it going to help you reach your stated professional goals? The quality of the proposed project is where they're evaluating how well thought out your project is. So they're going to look at things like a project timeline. Does it seem like you have a solid plan in place? And does the quality of the project show artistic vision if, for example, you're using funding to create new works? If you're using funding to attend something like a conference or a workshop, or you're going to be working with a mentor artist, they're going to look at the quality of the instructors and the mentors that you'll be working with. Administrative capability is where they're looking at whether or not they feel confident that you can execute this project successfully. So they'll also be looking at your project plan in this area, as well as things like your project budget. Does it seem like your budget is realistic? Have you thought of all of the different cost areas that you might need to consider and that sort of thing? And then lastly, public benefit, last but not least. So because this is a publicly funded program, again, through Montgomery County residents support, the applicants must make their projects available or accessible in some way to the Montgomery County community. So that for some of you, if you're creating something like a performance, that's pretty straightforward. You're already planning to present it publicly at the end of the project. But if you're doing something like a professional development opportunity, you might consider whether there's a way that you could share what you're learning through your opportunity with other members of the public. Now, this is an area that I think people often feel intimidating, but don't overcomplicate it. It doesn't have to be a huge event. You could be, some people have blogged about their experiences, so they're sharing what they're learning through their existing platforms. People have shared videos on social media. People have hosted their own virtual workshops or in-person workshops, all kinds of things. And we're happy to talk with you, bounce ideas around if you have questions about that. But something to keep in mind to help you to execute a public benefit portion of your project is that we have an awesome partnership with our friends at the Dayton Metro Library, where they have high quality performance and gallery spaces available at not only the downtown main branch, but all throughout the community at their many various awesome branches. And the library offers artists who are selected for artist opportunity grants the opportunity to use their spaces at no cost. If you can offer a program such as a performance, a gallery talk, a film screening, a workshop that is free and open to the public during their library hours. So basically in return for sharing your work as an artist with library patrons, the library will provide support for you to have an event space. So if this is something you think might be interesting or helpful to you, I've given you a couple contacts here. And again, I'll send out the slide deck at the end so you don't have to memorize these. But Mariah Johnson is the contact for anyone in the performing arts, and Caitlin Whistler will be your contact if you are a visual artist. So something to keep in mind. And while the library will hold off on finalizing any agreements they have with artists about sharing their work in spaces until they know who the artist opportunity grantees are, you are welcome to contact them now just to let them know that you're thinking about taking advantage of this opportunity if you're selected for funding. Okay. So the application is broken into a number of questions and components. We're not going to go through each one of them today, but I've pulled out a few areas where applicants often have questions to give you some suggestions. And it looks like a lot, maybe, if you've never done an application before or haven't done very many. But I always encourage artists to just keep in mind that your application is basically trying to do three things. And that is to show reviewers who you are as an artist and where you are in your career currently, to explain where you want to go next as an artist, and to show how this specific project or opportunity is going to help you get there. So if you think of those three guiding questions and make sure that your application is addressing them, you're good to go. And we break the application down into these separate questions in the hopes that it'll help you, think through each of those questions kind of strategically. So the first area that we will touch on briefly is the artist statement. Visual artists often have to write artist statements to share as part of things like exhibitions, but if you're not operating in that field, you might never have had to write one before. So an artist statement is your introduction to reviewers to who you are as an artist, including what kind of work you create, what kinds of themes you explore, and all of that good stuff. So an effective artist statement can range anywhere from 100 words to 300 words. So they're not extremely long, but it's enough space to tell people about yourself. And they tend to cover three main points. So the first would be aesthetic or style. So what is the kind of tone or vibe of your art that you create? Information about your existing body of work. So this is not only explaining literally what your work is, what's your artistic medium, what does your work look like, but also exploring those themes that you tend to cover in your work. So if you're really mission oriented and you want your work to be accomplishing a particular thing, then that's a great thing to share in your artist statement. And then your future vision as an artist. So where you see yourself evolving as an artist and where you want your work to go. I've given you an example of a really effective artist statement that we saw a couple of cycles ago from Marcia Pippinger, who is a rock star visual artist here. And she is a two-time Artist Opportunity grantee. She was awarded in 2018 and 2021, so you know that she knows what she's doing. And her artist statement, this is just an excerpt of it. It was a bit longer, but I highlighted a couple of the key areas. So she writes, I am an artist maker. I gravitate to color and texture. Collage is perfectly suited to my philosophy of visual expression. It is at once painting, drawing, sculpture, and assemblage. I tend to work in themes that interest me: walls, immigration, climate change. Most of my work is abstract, using various types of handmade papers with additions of rusted metal, stone, and other ephemera. My collages are generally quite colorful and textural. However, my work is expanding into new territory with what I think of as collage in 3 dimensions. I intend to create an art installation inside a shipping container. So I'll stop there to explain what makes this a really strong artist statement for this application. She starts out by explaining exactly what kind of artist she is. So she tells you her discipline up front. And then she goes into a description of the themes or the subject matter that she tends to explore with her work. And again, that's a really great idea to kind of give reviewers a deeper sense of who you are and why you create. And then she gives some really concrete descriptions of the materials that she uses so that reviewers who might not have seen her work before can start to visualize it. And then lastly, she sets up the rest of her application by explaining where she is now with her art, but then where she wants to go next. And so you can probably guess by the end of this artist statement, but her project in 2021 was to create an art installation inside of a shipping container. And so she's explaining in this artist statement why that's a natural next step for her. And then later in her application, when she gets to her project description, she's going to go into deeper detail about what that shipping container is going to look like, how it's going to work, and all of that. So this is a really awesome artist statement. It follows a very clean structure. It's easy and enjoyable to read. And if you want to learn how to write an artist statement just as strong, Marcia Pippinger is here to help you. She is going to be hosting a workshop with us to help Artist Opportunity Grant applicants craft their own artist statements. So I'll share a slide at the end of the presentation today, but to give you a heads up, her workshop is going to be on Tuesday, September 12th at noon. It'll be virtual on Zoom, just like we are today. And there's a link at cultureworks.org where you can go ahead and register for that workshop. So more on that later. The next thing that you will include with your application, which you're probably very excited about because your art probably speaks best for itself, right? So you will have the opportunity to provide work samples that the reviewers can take a look at. And again, the type of work sample will differ from artist to artist depending on your medium, but it could be images. You might upload some images to the application, or you can share a link to something like an image gallery if you have a website that you use that way. You might share video or audio clips. And if you do that, you'll want to use a link because large files, the application system doesn't like those. But you can share a link to something like YouTube or completely blanking your Spotify channel, anywhere where you're sharing your video and audio work. And if you're a writer, of course, you can upload manuscript pages. So we do give you some guidelines on the CultureWorks website about best practices to follow with work samples, but you want to think about the reviewers. You don't want to give them too many work samples because they have a finite amount of time to review everything. So we usually recommend that if you're uploading something like a video or an audio clip, to keep it under 6 minutes. If you're submitting manuscript pages, to keep it to around 10 pages maximum for them to look at. That being said, we strongly encourage you to include more than one work sample. 3 is a great number, and you want to make sure that at least one of those is work that you completed within the last year so that the reviewers can get a pretty well-rounded sense of what your work typically looks like, and they know exactly where you are at this point in time. And one last thing about that is if you are sharing your work samples by link, just keep in mind that the panelists are going to be reviewing these applications for a pretty long time. So from the beginning of October to mid-November. So make sure that that web page you're directing them to is going to stay up and active until mid-November at the very earliest. All right, now you get into the meat of your application, which is the description of your project or opportunity, and you get plenty of space. I think you can use up to 500 words. You might not need that much, but we want you to have flexibility. So in your project description, you're going to tell us the who, what, when, where, why of your project. So what is it? When is it going to happen? Where is it going to happen? Who's involved? Why is it significant for artists in your field? And if you're creating new work, maybe talk about what inspired you to explore this particular subject matter. So when you're doing your project description, you want to think about this from the perspective of someone who is not familiar at all with the work that you currently do, and maybe not even familiar with your artistic field. Again, some of the reviewers are going to be dancers, some will be writers, some will be visual artists. So if within your field, say you're going to this really amazing writers conference, and every writer in the world knows about this conference, but a musician might not. So make sure that you're being really clear about what your opportunity is and why it matters. Then you're going to have a question that asks you about the impact of this project or opportunity on your career and your work. And so here's where you can spell out some key professional and artistic goals that you have and why you're pursuing this opportunity at this time. So it's really important in both of these areas, again, to be specific and to think about this opportunity from the perspective of a relative outsider or newcomer to your artistic field. And let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything. I'm sure I am, but that's all right. Okay, you'll also have an opportunity to provide a project timeline. So this is very helpful for grant panelists to understand exactly how a project is going to happen. So you're basically just going to outline the steps it's going to take to implement your project. I'm picking on Marcia again because she writes great applications. So this was the timeline that she put together for that same application back in the 2021 cycle to create that shipping container visual art installation. So Marcia broke it down by month, and that's a great way to do it. For some projects, maybe you're working on a shorter time scale, so you're going to be doing, it's a 1 week thing and it's going to be broken into each day what you're doing. It just kind of depends. But month to month is a great way to do it. And she gives those key highlights. I need to complete some measurements of the shipping container to know what I'm working with. I need to start installing things. I need to paint the inside of it, and so on and so forth. So this is a really solid timeline. It's also nice to format it this way as kind of like a bulleted list almost, because it's very easy for reviewers to read it and see at a glance what the project involves. But that's not the only way you can do a timeline. I've shared this one for a couple of years because it's so excellent, and we have permission from the artists to share these application materials. And I've been very happy to see that this one has been picked up by some other applicants. So this was the timeline submitted with Zach Kalapi's application, also back in the 2020-21 cycle. And his was to launch his first solo exhibition. So he's also a visual artist. And he did his timeline a little bit differently. So he broke it down into phases, but then he also broke each phase down into what he was going to be working towards in terms of the art itself, and then his professional goals, or all of the stuff that needed to happen around the creation of the artwork itself. Now, I think this is really smart because as a writer, I know that I'm really good at keeping on my writing deadlines, but all the stuff that's supposed to happen around the writing itself, like, you know, promoting the writing that's going out into the world, working with a website, all of those kinds of things that are not the art itself tend to fall to the wayside. So you don't have to do your timeline this way, but I think it's a really smart way of organizing yourself and organizing your plan. So again, you have permission to steal this format. Okay, the next piece of the application puzzle is the project budget. Now, if you're like me, numbers are not your favorite friends in the whole world. So we want to make sure that you're not intimidated by this. So I'm going to show you what the project budget looks like. We give you a spreadsheet. You have to use that format because we want the reviewers to be able to look at the projects apples to apples. But that being said, before we get into it, we have another workshop for you coming up on Friday, September 8th with the artist Nicholas Arnold, who's going to do a deep dive into how to come up with a project budget and how to organize your supporting documentation. Highly recommend it because Nicholas Arnold probably laughs every time I say this, but he puts together the best expense documentation that I've ever seen. So, so he will show you how to organize things, both for your own sanity and for the benefit of the individuals reviewing your application. So all of that being said, I'm going to open up a new file here. And there we go. All right, so this is the project budget template that we give you. It's included in the application form. So again, you do have to use this format. But you'll notice on this first tab that you can't really click any of the boxes. That is not an error. That is for your benefit. So the first tab of this spreadsheet is going to autofill and auto-calculate so that you don't have to do a lot of math. Where you're going to go is down here on the second tab to the expense breakout. So we've broken you'll see we've broken the budget spreadsheet into all those expense categories I talked about earlier on. And this breakout tab is going to give each expense area its own little table. So basically what you're going to do is just go through and think about every item or every activity that you need to use grant funds for. So say under fees and travel, you know that you're going to need a round trip flight to Dallas. I'm making things up on the fly. And you're planning to use the Artist Opportunity Grant funds to cover the cost of that flight. And you know that it's going to be, I have no earthly idea, this is probably very optimistic. We'll say $500, why not? So you're going to say $500 of the Artist Opportunity Grant will cover the cost of this flight. Maybe you know the flight is going to cost more than that and you're planning to pay for some of it out of pocket. You're not required to, but maybe you want to. So you'll put the amount that you're paying out of pocket here. If you're using another grant that you've secured to cover that cost, you could put that information here. And if you go back to your budget overview tab, you'll see that it's automatically filling in those numbers for you. So this way, you and reviewers can see at a glance, here's how you're using the Artist Opportunity Grant, and then here's the total project budget if it's more than that maximum $5,000. One thing I'll note here is that there is an other category, so things that the Artist Opportunity Grant does not cover. So that would be things like food and beverages are not allowable expenses when you're dealing with public funds. So if you need to hire caterers for an event, then that would be something that you would need to be paying for either out of pocket or using some other kind of grant funding or sponsorship. So that's how that works. And along with your project budget, you're going to want to make sure that you're collecting documentation that supports the expenses you're outlining here. So you could take a screenshot, for example, of whatever your preferred flight booking website is, showing that that's how much that flight costs. If you're purchasing materials and supplies like canvases and brushes, you could take a screenshot of something like your online shopping cart, showing how much those materials cost, and so on and so forth. But again, check out that project budget workshop on September 8th to get even more information about how to compile your budget and supporting expense documentation. Okay, at this time, I'm going to do yet another new share. Maybe, there we go. And I'm going to show you just very briefly where the application lives in case you've never done this before. Again, it is all completed online. So the first step is you go to our website, which is cultureworks.org, and then you're going to go to apply for funding. And it will think about it. If you're on a desktop like I am, you can click Artist Opportunity Grants here at the top and it'll take you down to that section. If you're on a tablet or a phone, then you'll just want to scroll down. And boom, here we are, all the information you need to know about this grant program. You can see that the guidelines document is linked here. Later in the week, there will be a recording of today's info session and the slide deck if you'd like to look back at them. And then here's all the information about those workshops that I mentioned. So you can go to our website right now and start signing up for them. Next up, we have some project ideation sessions that are coming up next week. So these are quick 15-minute conversations with me. If you just aren't sure if your project or opportunity is a good fit for the program, sign up for one of these slots and we can talk through it. There's that budget workshop I mentioned coming up on September 8th, and then your artist statement workshop with Marcia coming up on September 12th. So all of the links to register for those opportunities are here. But if you keep going down, eventually you'll get to this Start Your Application button. And it's going to take you to an external site that looks like this. It's called Community Force, and this is what all of our applications run through. So I already have an account. So if you're going here for the first time, you're going to click on Apply, and I'm just going to log in. But if you've never done this before, you'll want to go down to this Create a New Account button, and it'll have you fill out some basic information. It does have a security feature that will require you to enter an authentication code that it will send to the email associated with your account. There we are. And this is what it looks like once you're signed in. So the grant application is broken into two sections. Contact information is just what it sounds like. You're just going to tell us your basic, how we can reach you. You'll also demonstrate your residency here, that you're a Montgomery County resident. So the meat of the application will be under this grant narrative section. And if you open that up, you can take a look here. And I won't go through this whole thing, but I just wanted you to know what to expect when you log in for the first time or the next time. But just some key highlights. If we go down here to your work sample section, so this is where I mentioned you'll have the option to either upload something like an image file or a Word document, or if you need to link to your work samples, you'll just give the URL here. And then tell us a little bit about the work samples you uploaded so the panelists have a good context for it. There's all the good stuff that we talked about during today's info session, so skipping ahead to the very end. We do ask for some optional demographic information. You don't have to fill out this portion, but it's really helpful to us if you do. It's all anonymous. The reviewers don't see this part. It's only for the staff. And the reason why we ask for this information is to make sure that our grant making is reaching a broad representation of our community. So if you're willing to answer those, it's very helpful, but again, you don't have to. When you're all done with your application, you'll just do an electronic signature at the bottom, save and return to dashboard, and it'll take you back to that page. Once you've completed both of these sections and they're at 100%, you will see a button that says Final Review and Submit. So people often forget this step. Once it says 100%, you haven't submitted yet. You have to do one more thing. So when you're ready, you'll hit Final Review and Submit. And it'll say, please click the checkbox at the top or the bottom to confirm that you reviewed your application. So you can click Continue Review, and it'll show you exactly what your application looks like. So this is what reviewers are going to see. And you'll go through, make sure all of your attachments are there, make sure that your narrative looks good. And then once you're happy with it, you'll check the box either here or all the way at the bottom of the screen and click Submit. And it'll say, thank you so much for submitting. And you'll get an email confirmation that your submission went through. So, all right. Last things, let me go down here. There we go. There we go. Okay. So just as a reminder, again, we do have some other applicant support offerings coming up. So take a look at those. If any of them look like a good fit, we would love to support you as you work on your applications. And you're also welcome at any point if you just want to reach out to me. Please feel free. I'm happy to help. I am a practicing artist myself. A lot of the team members here at CultureWorks are, and we know that it is a hard business sometimes, and we're here to support you through it. So don't be shy about asking questions. There aren't any bad questions. And on that note, let's see what we have in the Q&A. So if you have any other questions, we'll just hang out here for a few minutes so that I can answer them as we go. Let's see. Good. Someone pointed out, thank you. Someone said, I heard you mention that the artist has to have a 3-year history with their public presentation or publication or whatever discipline you're in. And when you looked at the website, it said it was listed as 1 year. Thank you for that, because that is a typo, so I will have to correct that. All right. Let's see, can you apply with multiple mediums for art? For example, a mic for a vocal reel, manuscript for a screenwriting conference, and travel for a musical theater workshop? That's a really great question. So for the purposes of this program, we do ask you to limit your proposal to 1 opportunity. Now, if you are a multidisciplinary artist, say you're doing some kind of a production, or you're creating a new work that's going to incorporate different mediums, then that could potentially work. But the examples that you provided, we would probably consider each of those to be a separate opportunity. So you could use funding to attend a musical theater workshop, but using funding for something like developing a reel that you're going to send out would probably be a separate opportunity. If it's a show that we're looking to hold to promote our art or performance, is it possible to include multiple artists? So that's a great question as well. And I think, and just send me chat messages if I'm misunderstanding these. But say, for example, you are doing a performance and you are the artist who's kind of leading this project, but you're going to have other artists involved. Then yes, you can include multiple artists in your project budget, for example, but only 1 artist can apply for funding for that project. So that's a really great question. If you have multiple artists all working together on a single project, you can't have more than 1 artist applying for funding to support that project. So somebody has to serve as the lead applicant. That's a great question. Someone asked if I'll be sending a copy of the recording to everyone. I absolutely will. If you registered today, as soon as the recording is posted on our website, you'll also get an email letting you know that it's there, but it'll definitely be up by Friday. Great question. Let's see. If I'm interested in an art residency and the cost is $6,000, can I use $5,000 from the grant and accept $1,000 in scholarship money from the residency? Absolutely. Great question. So yeah, I think I was probably, again, me and numbers aren't the greatest, so I was probably being unclear when I was explaining that. But the maximum amount that you can request from this program is $5,000. But yes, if your project is going to cost more than that, then you'll just explain in that project budget spreadsheet and then elsewhere in the application that you're going to cover the costs over that $5,000 using, for example, a residency scholarship or something like that. Wonderful question. And the last one that I see is if I graduate in December, but I'm applying for a project next year. So I believe that unfortunately, the way that we've handled this in the past is that at the time that you're submitting your application, you have to be a non-student. So unfortunately, you would have to hold off and apply in the next grant cycle. But that's a very good question. And I believe, I collaborate with musicians outside of Ohio. Can the grant be used to pay for travel? Sorry, my lights turned off. For the collaborating musician to Ohio for performance or recording? That's a really wonderful question. If you are the artist applicant, as long as you are a resident of Montgomery County, if you're collaborating with someone who needs to come here to work with you on the project, then yeah, I think you could use the grant funds to support that effort as long as you're the lead artist and you are a resident of Montgomery County. Good question. Okay. Well, I will hang on if you'd like to submit more questions. The ones you've sent in so far have been outstanding, but I see that we are at 12:56. So for everyone who signed in today, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget the application deadline is Friday, October 6th at the very, very, very end of the day for you night owls like me. But if you have any questions between now and then, please take advantage of those opportunities we have coming up, and also don't hesitate to reach out to me. My contact information there is on the screen, and you'll also be hearing from me later in the week when I send out today's recording. So thank you again. I can't wait to see your applications, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.